NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
So this last panel is a little bit less technical and more focused on humanizing the client, doing outreach, and community relations when it comes to doing defense work on these cases. And so to kick us off, did you want to go first? So to kick us off, Devon Reeves, who is an amazing community organizer and advocate in the addiction opioid response space, based out of Philadelphia. He runs the Pennsylvania Harm Reduction Coalition, right?
Yep.
He is going to talk about sort of his view from the trenches of trying to change policy and community responses to overdose and how that fits in with the surge in drug delivery resulting in death prosecutions.
Awesome.
Take it away.
All right, everybody. I promise that I will be as high energy as possible. One, I would like to say I'm traumatized from mens rea, this Ricker thing. I am not a lawyer, and I feel very confused, okay? So I just want to say thanks for that. So this is a picture of me where I think I look cool. So I put it in PowerPoint presentations. I feel like kind of like a badass. This is my Instagram and Twitter handle. We also, I tweet a lot of stuff today, so feel free to make fun of my silly legal interpretations. And if you like sassy memes, follow me on Instagram. I am the executive director of the Pennsylvania Harm Reduction Coalition. The mission of the Pennsylvania Harm Reduction Coalition is to promote the health, dignity, and human rights of individuals who use drugs in communities impacted by drug use. It took like 15 people 3 hours to come up with that definition, which was super annoying. And then we spent like the next year figuring out how we're gonna do that, right? And so we do this by increasing the knowledge and capacity of those impacted by social inequity, criminalization, and stigma, educating key decision makers on effective policy and advocating for its implementation, and building community power and leadership through training, outreach, and engagement. So these are some of the organizations that knew who I was, supported the idea of what we were doing. And what you can kind of see is that there's really people from all over the state and all over the country that were like, yeah, we like this Devon Reeves guy, and we think he's like smart enough to write a letter of support for us so we can get some money to start this organization. We are a coalition of all of the syringe service programs in the state of Pennsylvania. These are some of the syringe service programs. Prevention Point Philadelphia is the largest syringe service program in the state, and it's a large social service provider. We really are tackling the overdose epidemic by focusing on those most likely to experience an overdose. I'm a social worker. So in social work school, we have this idea of deserving and undeserving, right, of social services, right? So the most deserving person is the veteran, right? They've written a blank check up to and including their life to protect our freedom. And for that, we're supposed to give them excellent services. Fun fact, veterans do not get excellent services in our society, right? And then the least deserving person is like the old black man that shoots heroin or drinks too much alcohol under the bridge begging for dollars. Actually, that person in our society doesn't even exist. We are going down the street, he asks for $1, we don't even acknowledge them, right? They don't even exist in our society. And many of the communities that we're focusing on do not exist from a policy perspective, from a social service perspective, and surely not from a funding perspective, right? We're focusing on the 3 groups that are most likely to experience an overdose, right? And so that is, number one, people that are using drugs right now. We really hate those people. We do not like people that are using drugs. And so we're working with our local syringe service programs to help them with capacity building, help them get more syringes out of the community, and help the people that they're working with have better outcomes. We're also working on legislation in the Capitol, grant writing, a whole bunch of things with those programs. Number 2, our returning citizens. So we know that people who are coming out of jail with an opioid use disorder are 40 to 120 times more likely to die of an overdose. The sick thing is most of the counties you live in also know this and aren't doing shit about it. So we're working with each one of the county jails to expand access to medication-assisted recovery as well as naloxone distribution in the county jails. Now that's really the minimum that needs to be happening. It's only happening in one of all the county facilities in the state. Number 3, treatment overdose prevention. We know people that are getting out of treatment are at an advanced risk of overdose, right? Anybody who's been absent for a period of, from opioids for a period of time is more likely to overdose, right? We've got a treatment system that says, John, you have to get well if you want to survive your substance use. And we want treatment centers to start saying, you have to be alive if you want to have a chance to get well. We want treatment centers to educate their participants on what harm reduction is, give out naloxone and give naloxone to their family members. So that kind of gives you a flavor of our philosophy. To put it another way, we represent the person that's using drugs, that's homeless right now. We also represent the person that's using drugs that is housed or a recreational drug user. We represent people that work at harm reduction programs, and we represent harm reduction programs. We know that people who use drugs are undesirable in our community. We also know that substance use disorder affects everybody in our society. If everybody who is in recovery, everybody who lost somebody to an overdose, if everybody who was touched by the racist war on drugs work together, the laws, this Ricker thing, all of this stuff you've been talking about wouldn't fly. But that isn't what happens. Right? You have somebody that's affected by substance use disorder, they don't say anything. They're ashamed. They're not my baby boy, not my princess. It wasn't us. They died suddenly in their sleep is what it says in the obituary. And we think that that is no longer acceptable. And we want to build power of those that are affected by substance use disorder and the racist war on drugs. And so what we started to do is we started to train people in the community about what the problems are, because most people think that opioids are the problem. Let me tell you that opioid overdose is actually a symptom of the problem, not the problem. We start talking about communicable disease, HIV, hepatitis C. We start teaching people how to tell their story in an effective way, how to tell that story to legislators, how to be impactful on social media. And in this last year, we trained 350 people on how to be advocates. And a lot of people are like, that's a lot of people. But the truth is it's not nearly enough. So just last month, we brought, one of my favorite things to do is teach people how to be advocates, right? I'm an advocate, now you're an advocate, but it's too slow. So just last month, we brought a bunch of people from across the state, and we taught other people how to teach other people how to be advocates, right? So now we're getting into the real movement building game. That's phase 2 of the HERO initiative, right? Our goal is to train thousands of people and help them organize in their local community to fight against the war on drugs. And so the idea is that Devon Reeves and his little 2.5 staff is not enough to make a difference. There are 67 counties in Pennsylvania, and not one of them is doing an excellent job responding to the overdose epidemic. A lot of people say that Allegheny County or Philadelphia County are doing a great job. Let me tell you, we got lots of problems in those places, and we've got the collar counties outside of Philadelphia that are really messing things up in an amazing way, because we got to be different than Philly. You know what I'm saying? Right? And so the idea is that we can partner with you all to help make your job easier, right? And so some of the ways we're doing is we're talking right to law enforcement. Now let me tell you, I am a former drug user, right? I used drugs for roughly 10 years, right? On August 20th, 2007, I overdosed from speedballing. I woke up at the hospital, University of Pennsylvania, right? But I had access to an abundance of resources. I went to rehab, I got better, I went back to school, got a bachelor's, went back to the University of Pennsylvania to get a master's degree, right? And now I started this nonprofit. I was not somebody that hung out with cops. I'm anti-cop. But I started talking to cops about, hey, this is how we can see the intersection of public health and public safety. In the last year, we've trained over 250 law enforcement on what harm reduction is, on what naloxone is. And each one of those law enforcement agents could be an ally to you if we connect. I don't know where you all are from. I know she's from Montgomery County. That's it. And her partner's from Montgomery County. But the rest of you all, we've done trainings with law enforcement in Montgomery County. We know progressive progressive police chiefs. I'm sorry, we've got one of those in Philly. I was confused. But these people can be not always people that can say public comments, but sometimes they can have back conversations with people. We also do a lot of naloxone distribution, right? So I had a friend, Emma Semler, in Philadelphia, who her little sister were getting high in a KFC in West Philly. and they were with another girl, Jenny, and I knew Jenny from the rooms. Jenny was like 17. And Jenny overdosed, they panicked, and they ran away. Emma's doing 21 years in jail now at the federal level. This was before 911 Good Samaritan policies. This was before access to the lock zone, right? I was part of the team that helped pass David's law in the state of Pennsylvania, which is a law that provides for naloxone access, that provides for 911 Good Samaritan policies that, the DAs are kind of smacking around. But one of the things that we do is make sure people have access to naloxone, because the truth is that people who use drugs are really afraid of calling cops. And you ask why? Because we know that they're still being charged. They're just not going to call. It is what it is. We're afraid of the police state. And I don't blame them. So we've given lots of doses of naloxone out. So here are some of the ways that I want you to think about how we could partner. So, when we see that press conference, when the DA goes, this person is peddling poison in our community, then we're going to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law, and this nice, white, Caucasian mother deserves justice. And God forbid the person who did the delivering of drugs is black, then we're in a lot of trouble, right? But we have moms who lost kids and dads who lost kids who say, I don't blame that person. I will write an op-ed. They have the right messaging, they can talk to reporters, and they're prepared to do that. You are already fighting this battle from a PR perspective with one arm tied behind your back. Well, don't worry, fam, I got your back. I'll be the other arm for you. Our squad will be the other arm for you. Another thing that we can do is if you have a parent, if there's that wants to be engaged in this process, that wants to fight back, we can train them on how to talk about this. Because I've seen so many lawyers up here talk about substance use disorder the wrong way. It's not addiction, it's not substance abuse, right? We know from research that when we call this language, when we talk about this with the wrong words, it biases the people around us, right? Some of you all may need some training. Because when you call your client an addict, what the jury sees in their head is the guy under the bridge begging for the dollar, right? It's not a person with the substance use disorder. Whenever we put the person first, the person is always more capable. When I was at the University of Pennsylvania, there was a study on children with autism. And when described in the story, autistic Bobby was less capable than Bobby with autism, right? That's whenever we don't do person first, we think less about that entity. Another thing that we're trying to do is actually end the war on drugs in Pennsylvania. I do not think that we are going to pass a law to get rid of drug delivery resulting in deaths, right? We saw North Carolina pass the law. Somehow the governor of Virginia vetoed their law, but we're kind of stuck with it, right? And you guys are fighting these great battles, but if you want to have less of these cases on your desk, how about you partner with us to get naloxone out into the community? How about you partner with us to do a training in your community? Let's show your local DAs that we have power, right? If they start losing these cases, if the public doesn't have appetite for this, if we run PR campaigns in your community, they're not going to be interested in fighting. And we can work together. I will bring law enforcement, I will bring progressive DAs, I will bring police chief, I will bring moms, I will bring these people to your community to talk to your key decision makers. Not everybody wants to hear from the black guy from Philly who's got a lot of tattoos. Okay, sometimes people love me. Not everybody doesn't. But DAs like talking to other DAs, right? Police chiefs like talking to other police chiefs. Sergeants like talking to other sergeants. And I have those relationships across the Commonwealth, and I want to bring those relationships to you. Thank you. That's all I've got. And here are all my contact information. You can text me, tweet me, Instagram me, or email me.
I think the idea, we haven't talked much about sort of the victim perspective, but it's such a powerful tool that DAs or prosecutors in general are so incredibly adept at using selectively, cherry picking those victim stories and bringing the parents into those press conferences, and bringing the parents into the courtrooms to essentially build on someone's tragedy to ratchet up the punishment for your client. And there has to be a counter narrative. That narrative that people want vengeance and want somebody in prison for a decade or whatever that might be, that narrative deserves to be challenged. And I think that's where the work that Devin is doing is so critical in building that power, building that counter narrative to challenge that sort of vengeance-based prosecutorial response. So I wanted to now, unless there are any questions or comments, I wanted to turn to Josh, who has been a local reporter in this area for some years. And Josh, the way that I first met Josh is that he started writing articles specifically looking at the stories of folks who are charged with DDRD and exposing the reality versus the rhetoric, exposing that gap between the reality and the rhetoric. So, the sort of the story that prosecutors love to tell about how this person was, kind of a depraved, that the dealer was depraved and they're going after kingpins, and exposing some really absurd, tragic storylines with a lot of these prosecutions. So I wanted to give Josh a chance to talk about that work and kind of how he came about to focus on this beat, and also to talk a little bit about the relationship and what advice he might have for all of you in how to work with the media, how to work with reporters, local reporters such as himself, who tend to have a very solid bias towards the law enforcement prosecutorial perspective. Because let's be honest, crime reporters use cops and prosecutors as the main source of information. That's their beat. And so for them to challenge the narrative that prosecutors have, that police have, is really, really hard. It basically will, in many ways, eliminate the main source of information. So, Josh, what advice would you have?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll start off with a big caveat. I am not here to make excuses for my industry, because there is lots of bad journalism that gets out there. Hopefully what I can talk to you about is maybe why some of that happens, so that you can short circuit it and get around what the structural problems or what the problems are with that. Just to back up real quickly, just to give an explanation of my experience in my career. So I started at the ripe age of 19. I worked for a TV station. I was a live truck operator, cameraman, all that kind of stuff. Behind the scenes, I then started working for newspapers, because in 2013 that felt like the up and coming industry to get into, and everybody's buying newspapers and all that. And now I write for The Appeal, which if you don't know The Appeal, theappeal.org, highly recommend it. Keep me employed, that'd be wonderful. We're a nonprofit national online news outlet that focuses on largely local issues that drive mass incarceration. So local district attorneys, local things, and how that plays into the broader picture. And the reason that I say all of this is I have experience with most types of media, most types of news, and I have experience with the different cycles that come with that, and the idiosyncrasies that come with the different types of outlets and the different places that you're going to be dealing with. And they are different, and they all have things that they are going to want out of you that are not the same from one to the other. So obviously, cops, prosecutors, they are one of the main sources of information that with these stories, especially, you get one of these cases, they trot out the news conference, the TV cameras show up, the news reporters show up, all that, and they talk about how awful this is. And at best, you're going to wind up usually with a local reporter, if there is an attorney of record at that point calling to ask for a comment. Sometimes not even getting that. But my point with that would be the reason that news reporters go to the cops, go to the prosecutor, and that they become such an integral source, they're willing to talk. They're willing to give them information and we have a story that has to be written. We have a newscast that has to go out, and we need somebody to give us information. There's a whole other into why we cover crime and why that's always considered a newsworthy thing, and I'm happy to explain that if anybody wants to know. These stories are going to get covered, and if you are not willing to talk about it, and obviously for obvious reasons, maybe you can't talk about it, those stories are getting written. And if there is not a counterbalanced voice, if you're not speaking to the media, if you're not giving the media someone to talk to, and talk to in the time frame that they have to turn that story, at best you're going to wind up getting John Smith's attorney did not respond for comment, did not want to, did decline comment.
The other thing is, if you live in a rural town, everybody knows the kid that passed away, right? Those conversations are happening the next day at the breakfast table, at high school, right? If you're not controlling the narrative early, the narrative is on its own.
Okay, so this gets into why crime is crime is just considered a newsworthy thing to cover. It's something that affects the community. And what winds up happening is you have an official document, which could be the affidavit, police report, all that kind of stuff. So they have the ability to report on it. Lots of outlets, newspapers consider themselves to be the newspaper record, that it's supposed to be a record of what happened at the time. And what happened at the time is the person being charged. Again, I'm not here yes, absolutely they should be. Especially when you're talking about a small area, you are not dealing with people who have...
This ain't the New York Times.
They don't have a specialized understanding of the topic to know how to push back on some of these things. Other than to say, should this person be charged, yes or no? To get into the, is this good for public policy? Is it not good for public policy? You're talking, most of these people are there for a few years, if that, and moving on to something else because that's the only way they're going to make more money. You're not building institutional knowledge with that. And again, none of this is to say that that's an okay thing. What I would say, my biggest advice, how many of you have contact with your local newspapers, at least letting them know that you are there, that you could potentially be a source and have talked to the reporters ahead of time? Is that okay? So a couple hands. I can tell you in my experience, most defense attorneys don't come to me and say, hey, I'm here when you need me. So that is not a source that I had unless I'm developing myself, which made when it's on deadline, that's a tougher thing to be like, well, which person should I be calling? Who's there for me? You need to be building these relationships early and often, and being there for that person. There's a question.
Sorry, yeah.
It's all good.
I'm certainly not trying to speak for everyone, but I think part of the reason why those of us at this table maybe don't talk to the media is because everything that, well, I don't want to say everything, but we talked earlier about how language is important, right? Mm-hmm. And how do we get the journalist to write an article objectively and not just use the language of the DA's office or of the police report? Even if I went and talked to them and explained things, I'm sorry, even like we read articles, okay, where they talk about what has to be proved at a preliminary hearing, and we read that and we laugh. It's wrong, and we could call them and say, hey, this is an incorrect statement of fact that you're making here. But they don't care. In fact, I think someone has brought it to their attention, and Liz brought it to their attention, and they just kept publishing it the same way. So, how do we get them to write articles objectively? How do we get them to publish photos of our clients looking sympathetic and not the mugshot of our client looking like a gangbanger as opposed to the victim who is like just one who it could have been reversed. Like they could have been two people. Right. I'm sorry.
When was the last time you asked a reporter out for a cup of coffee? When was the last time you asked a reporter out to grab beers?
Which happens with cops and prosecutors all the time.
Right. So like, for example, right, I am a lobbyist, community organizer. All of the beat reporters in the state that cover opioids, 15 of them that are halfway decent, I have their cell phone number.
I'm hoping I'm in that category.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course. But like newspaper records, like what town are you guys in?
Oof.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. But so on the bright side, when we had naloxone day, we saw that the editorial board pushed back that giving out naloxone was good. Right. That happened in your town. I read it. So there are open-minded people there. Listen, do I want to go out with reporters and buy them beer when I don't even drink beer? Do I want to go out for those coffee meetings? No. But when a thing happens around opioids, half the time I'm getting a phone call, I'm getting the quote in the newspaper, I can feed them information on the back end. No matter how much they suck, and I'm sure they do suck in your town, if you don't build a relationship with them, one or a couple of you, there's nothing is going to change.
Well, not to put the onus on people who are already overworked and overburdened. You know,
Sure.
it's not like your job is to go out and talk to people.
Right. Or I
Their
could go
job
talk
is
to
not.
them if you want.
But one thing
would.
that I wanted to pose as a possibility, and I don't know if this is going to work, and I'm just brainstorming here, but one of the things that we've been talking about today is sort of information that goes beyond individual cases. So what does the picture look like in Pennsylvania? What does the picture look like nationally? What are some of the most absurd stories about drug-induced? We've heard a bunch of them just today. And so what if instead of commenting on a particular case, which you can't do, you can say, look, we can't comment on this particular case, but Pennsylvania leads the nation in these kind of prosecutions. The most people who are charged with these crimes are not actually dealers. And in this, the fact pattern in this case may fit other cases that have, that wound up, getting reversed or whatever it might be, right? So use the information that you've gotten from today's training to provide reporters with a broader picture that they can look to. There's been a lot written about this issue already in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. So maybe, providing that kind of context can help educated reporters. It may or may not work, but at least you're giving them something and just saying, instead of saying just, I have no comment.
And I think there's also the issue of there are different types of stories. So there's going to be the short story about the person getting arrested, and then there should be, and this is where really sending somebody to be willing to talk about the issues with drug delivery resulting in death, get someone like Devin who's get them his information. That's where you can start to have the real impact with it, because what they should be doing at that point is not looking at it as just a single case, but looking at it more broadly. What are the implications that are happening here? But it really comes down to the relationships that you're building. And I know mugshots are a total separate issue, and yes, the best I can say about mugshots and some of that stuff is make it available to them as fast as you possibly can. If there is a way to have another picture there when the person is arrested, that's ideal. Make it available as fast as you possibly can, because what's going to wind up happening is an editor, someone along the lines is going to say, we need art to go along with this. Well, if there isn't a press conference and they can't take a picture of the district attorney standing at a podium, or they can't take a picture of something else, what's available to them is the mugshot. And for as awful as that is, that's what's going to get used. If you have something else that you can give to them, something else quickly give to them within that news cycle, hopefully that's something that they would take, and hopefully it's something they would use.
The duty that we have is to our clients. Mm-hmm. So on a larger level, I think what we're talking about here is helpful to get the word out that all of the treatment over punishment, et cetera, should be the focus. But depending on what county you're in, if your duty is to your client and you're dealing with the discretion of the DA that's prosecuting, or the cops that are prosecuting the case, or the judges you're in front of, trying the case in the media more than likely, especially in our county, is going to put a bigger target on your client.
Sure.
As opposed to having a conversation with you about the procedural norms or clarifying errors in stories is one thing, but to address a case that's pending before it's gotten to court, you're pretty much guaranteeing that you're screwing your client over, even if the public may feel sympathetic for them. You're not doing them any favors in the courtroom.
Sure, and that is they are going there has to be another voice there for them to talk to and listen to. It doesn't necessarily have to be you.
Could be that guy.
It could be him. Yeah. I'm sure there are advocates in Lancaster County who, if you can build that relationship with the reporters and say, hey, I can't talk on this, but there's this person, there's X, Y, Z. If you're talking to a TV reporter, if you're talking to WGAL, my friend Matt Barcaro, who I used to call my nemesis because he scooped me on a few stories, which did not make me happy. Somebody who's willing to go, there has to be somebody willing to go on camera. They must be willing to go on camera, or you are not going to get somebody on TV to talk. Having those resources there for them, and again, it's not to make the excuses for it. You guys are overworked. Newspapers are overworked. TV is overworked. When I was at the Sentinel in Carlisle, we were turning out 2 to 3 stories a day. That ate up most of the day. There wasn't a ton of time left to really dig a whole lot more. And that's indicative of pretty much everywhere. When I worked at the TV station, I mean, you're turning a story in a couple hours. The news cycle in TV is drastically shorter than it is for print. So having those resources there for them and being an advocate that there are people that they can talk to get that counterbalancing voice. And I'm sure it is much more difficult if you're public defenders as compared to the private bar to be just an expert source outside of it, just ethically. But I know that there were private attorneys that I tried to call. It usually what we can call the second day story, the follow-up story. It may not be the person of record for that case, but somebody that I could talk to about what are the issues with this kind of case to follow up on. And that's something, again, that's stuff that you can talk to the reporters about. Even if it's I can't specifically talk about this, but here's this person, there's their contact information, and make sure that person knows that this reporter may be calling you, really could use you to be a voice in that. There has to be someone there. If there is not someone there, and it is somebody that you have the affidavit, you have the police talking about it, they're going to write that story. It is going to go on TV, and it is at best it's going to be these people did not respond for comment.
Yeah, I think we need to build a bigger arsenal for the information, situation, because that's being dominated. So Tony, and then we're gonna shift to Carrie because I want to make sure that she gets a word.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll be very quick. And I really appreciate this conversation. And I've done media work for the last 20 years. The last 19 for a group called the Drug Policy Alliance that was trying to work for alternatives to the war on drugs and put out reports called Overdose is Not Murder and on documenting that. And for the last 9 months, I've been at Vital Strategies. So I totally sympathize with the position of people, and especially specific cases, and it might hurt your case, and that is real, and we take that seriously. And also what everyone on the stage is saying, we have to use communications and the media to also advance that there, the points that were made, that the vast majority of people who are facing 10 or 20 years are not major drug dealers. These are people's friends. The article that Devin mentioned was a very heartbreaking story about that young woman who not only lost her friend, but is now serving 20 years behind bars. And that was an example. If you read that, I think that would cause people to pause for a second. And that was an example of a humanizing story. And it's also very complicated because some people aren't comfortable sharing their stories, but then there are going to be, if it's not you in your specific case, there are organizations to point them to, whether it's Devin and his group, Leo, we got Bonnie, we got Vital Strategies. There are third parties who can advocate and say, this is not the way. There's also parents who have lost loved ones, who do not want to see people sent away. So it does not have to be your case. It does not have to be you. There are other organizations that can make these points and say this. Just the last thing, talking about the media, we have some good stories. There's a great reporter who's writing about this conference. Her name is Aubrey Whelan from the Philadelphia Inquirer. People may know her work. She's going to have a good story that comes out that talks about this. So when reporters call you, you can also say, look, there's a lot of lawyers and people are thinking about, a lot of debate about whether this is the right way. Here's some stories, here's some organizations. You can find other voices to be third-party advocates on your behalf and your clients. Thank you.
And there's I'll step over you. Just doing it
Yeah,
very, very fast.
Okay.
There's also literature, studies, all those sorts of things that you can have in your back pocket that when these things arise, that you can send to people. Obviously, that's who reporters should be trying to find those things, but to advocate, no disagreement. But to advocate, the easier you can make that information available to people, the better.
So I'm going to turn the page and talk a little bit about other ways and other places that we can advocate for our clients. Because while I don't disagree with anything that's been said up here, and if you have the opportunity to talk with reporters, to share your message, to share what's really going on, I think we should do that. But here's where the real advocacy and storytelling matters. It matters in 2 occasions. 3, matters in your pretrial conversations with district attorneys, when you are advocating for resolutions for your cases and you're bringing information about your client, your particular client, to the district attorney to give them reasons why your client is worthy of consideration for something better than 20 to 40 years in a state prison. When you're talking to a jury, if you're in a situation where you're talking to a jury, explaining to the jury who your client is, not just what your client is charged with, and then, of course, if you find yourself at a sentencing proceeding in front of a judge. One of the things that we always have to remember as public defenders, no matter what type of case you're dealing with, is that no person is defined by any single act that they have done. We are not the product of our worst choices. We are the product of so many other things. The Commonwealth, the district attorney, is going to tell a story. They're going to tell this peddling poison narrative. It is our job to tell a different story. And one of the things that we learned today, and that we all intrinsically know already, because you've done this work, you know that the reasons that our clients find themselves in the criminal justice system has nothing to do with them being bad people. It has to do with the circumstances that they grew up in. It has to do with the fact that they suffer from substance use disorder. It has to do with economic factors. It is your job to tell your client's tale. And that means really painting the story. Think about the difference in phrasing. It's one thing to say, well, my client had a tough life. Okay, well, what does that mean? It doesn't really mean much of anything to me, and it shouldn't mean much of anything to a judge or even to a district attorney. So this is where you have to tell the story. Instead of saying, my client had a tough life, what are those anecdotes that you've learned from your client? What about the time that your client's family had to move when they were in 7th grade because their house had been shot up and they were terrified, and your client changed school districts, and the one teacher who had figured out that they didn't know how to read wasn't with them anymore? So they spent the rest of their schooling career with teachers not understanding that they weren't at the same level as everyone else. Do you see how that story is different than my client had a tough life? We know that trauma impacts our clients in so many ways. You have to know your client, not just what they're charged with. Think about sentencing or your conversations about negotiations as a photo album. The crime that your client is charged with is a snapshot. It's nothing more than that. You have to tell the photo album of your client's life, all of the things that came before that particular photo, and all the things that can potentially come after and that won't come after if your client is incarcerated. One of the things that we struggle with in our county, it's become very clear that the district attorney's office is not having conversations with the families of the deceased, talking about the fact, by the way, this individual actually also has a substance use disorder. They're not talking about that. They don't know any of that information. The families are being fed information about who our clients are that is inaccurate. And it is incumbent upon us to start changing that narrative. And that means getting to know your client, knowing everything about them, and telling those stories to the district attorneys. It even means, in certain situations, perhaps reaching out to the family of the deceased, reaching out to their family and bringing them into the fold. And sometimes it may be a lot easier than others to do that. Small communities in particular, you know these people. You may even have some of these people reaching out to you because they don't think it's fair what's going on. They know that on any given day, it could have been their loved one who was being charged instead of their loved one being the person who died. But also, use the resources that you have within your office. If you have investigators, if you have social workers, if you have teammates, have them try outreach to victims. That way, if you're not yourself comfortable talking, if you don't want to put yourself out there like that, you still need the information. You might be surprised by what you get back, and you can always use an investigator as your filter. Draft a letter. I want to talk to you. I want to explain things to you. At a bare minimum, if you're never having those communications, please use sentencing as your opportunity to talk about your client and to really tell your client's tale, because, again, this desire for vengeance, I think we would see a massive change in it if people understood who is actually being charged in the vast majority of these cases. We're not getting drug kingpins. We're not getting just drug dealers. We're getting people who have a history of trauma, a history of abuse in their lives, a history of poverty, a host of other issues, and that's the person that you want a judge thinking about when they're imposing a sentence.
Beautifully stated and certainly true, but is it, just pushing back a little bit on that notion, is it also not true that for prosecutors, it's not so much that they don't know that this person may have faced difficulty in terms of their substance use or had other things going on in their life, but it is about building power and building your career. And the incentive structure for prosecutors is to essentially create more notches on their sort of, on their belt with these convictions.
I don't know that I think that that's entirely true. I certainly think that, for some prosecutors, that's absolutely the case. I can say that I think it's pretty clear that in our county, this has become a particular statute that has become very targeted and is being used to further agendas. However, what I do also think is that we are starting to see, as insignificant as it may seem, 2019 is the first calendar year that we have seen in our county a difference in the way that people are being charged up front. 2017, every person, no matter what role they played, were being charged with a drug delivery resulting in death. Same in 2018. We're suddenly now seeing a couple of these people being charged with involuntary manslaughter instead, which is a massive difference in terms of the level of incarceration that you're facing, as well as the seriousness of the offense. The fact that even a small bit of the cases are being treated differently means, I believe, frankly, that the advocacy that has been happening in these cases in our county, these conversations, the way that we are advocating, and probably, I hope, maybe I'm naive, some degree of knowledge that is coming from other areas of the community to the district attorney's office is what's accounting for that change, that we are starting to see a difference, that there's at least some distinction between what the Commonwealth considers to be dealers and what they consider to be also users. They're not quite there yet, but there has been some change. And I think that that's where we come in. When we fight these cases, when we start bringing our clients' stories to them, when we start really explaining our clients as human beings and not as drug dealers or poison peddlers, I think you can start seeing some of these changes.
Yeah, I think, I get it. You guys are overworked, you're busy, and you're like everybody, right? You're like public defenders, you're probably not paid enough, you got school debt, me too, right? But the individualistic solution for a systematic problem, I don't even know how to say this without cursing, is not going to get the job done, right? And so whatever you're doing at your job, it's not enough. Sorry, it just isn't. We have to collectively act to be part of the change. Whether that means someday I'm going to run to be a progressive district attorney, I'm going to get involved with the judge's election, I'm going to be part of my party. I mean, we have a racist war on drugs that also really screws over rural areas, right? A drug dealer in Philly is not the same thing in Montgomery County. I don't know why that is. It's not the same thing in Lancaster County. I don't know what that is. You know what I mean? But your cases, these cases are, people are going away forever, 20 years. And they're getting out. When they get out, they're going to end up dead because we never gave them any treatment. They're being sentenced to death. It's literally somebody's entire life. And if you want to be about a systematic change, please connect me, because I don't know any other way to fix this. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just an advocate. And I give that same speech to everybody. Everybody can do the system stuff.
Well, the good news also that there's, NACDL and other organizations, the defense bar collectively does have a lot of influence. And so getting those organizations on board and working towards systematic legal change, whatever that might be, I think that's another avenue for advocacy that doesn't work on the individual level but works on the systemic level. Are there any other questions, comments? Yeah.
Sorry. Is there for lack of a better term, something similar, a general sense among statewide what the sentence is likely to be when the defendant pleads guilty and plays by their rules as opposed to pisses them off by going to trial? At least where I am, the sentences cover the gamut for the same offense. There's just nothing, and I'd like to hear from my colleagues here in the whole room about that.
Obviously, I can only speak to Montgomery County, but I can certainly tell you that there is people that are entering pleas to the drug delivery resulting in death, meaning they have not been able to negotiate to manslaughter. Typically, the numbers that they're looking at are somewhere in the 4 to 8 or 5 to 10 year range, which is either the bottom of the standard range for a 0 or slightly below it. That's really important to remember, that someone with a 0 prior record score who is convicted of a drug delivery resulting in death, the standard range of the sentencing guidelines start at 5 years. So pleas are typically working out to about that 4 to 8, 5 to 10. We've had a limited number that have gone to jury trials. They have not gone well, and the sentences reflected how not well they have gone. Now, what I can say about that is that the worst sentence that our county has received in this, there were circumstances that make it slightly unpleasant that may explain that sentence. This was an individual who overdosed in a home. Aid was not rendered or called, again, because everyone in the home is afraid to have interactions with police. However, there was some moving of the individual outside of the home. There may have been the use of a dog collar to awaken the individual. There were some facts that made it unpleasant, and that person's sentence reflects those facts. But I think at least in our county, it'd be fair to say that there is a tax that is being assessed if you have a jury trial.
I think that's pretty standard.
It's not really. I can't speak comprehensively, but I mean the 4 to 8, 5 years somewhere in there. From the cases that I've seen, that tends to be the standard. York County tends to appear to be an outlier in how long they go for these sentences. Lancaster may also, because Lancaster, you're what, with like 60, 70 cases of these in the last 3 years?
I mean, here's the thing. Here's the thing that drives me through the wall is that we could invest the same amount of money that we do in one of these drug charges and give naloxone out like there's no tomorrow. We can give sterile syringes out. We can put out information. This poor bastard gives his girlfriend Suboxone instead of naloxone because we don't give people who use drugs health care information, right? So it's none of it makes any sense, right? It's war on drugs 7.0, 7.8, whatever. But there are organizations in Lancaster that give out naloxone. I know that because they get it from me, right? So I'm gonna come right over to your table afterwards, and I'd love to get drinks or coffees or whatever, and really figure out what you all know that I don't know and how I can be supportive, because the whole entire county that you're in just needs a lot of help.
And that fiscal argument tends to be the one that I live in Franklin County. I'm in deep red Pennsylvania. The progressive be nicer to people because it's the right thing to do is not an argument that tends to fly with people who are making the policy decisions. The fiscal argument of we're spending a ton of money to do this when we could be getting better results from something else does. And what I can say with a lot of these, any criminal issue, there obviously tends to be the dichotomy that the district attorney and the police are the people who care about public safety. The public defenders, the defense attorneys, they're the people who care about the criminals who are getting out and they're going to do all these awful things to society. When the reality is everybody cares about public safety. Everybody wants to see overdose deaths go down. We differ. Almost everybody wants to see
Except for Devin.
I have. Yeah.
Learned very early on not to read the comments.
Yeah.
Not only do I read the comment sections, I argue in the comment section. Yeah, but we often don't have to convince everybody, right? It's like when I'm trying to pass a law in Pennsylvania, there are 253 legislators, which is an astronomical amount, but it's really like 10 old white dudes I need to convince, right? But you know what I'm saying? So like your town has those 10 old white dudes, right? And some of them may have been your mentors or people that live in your block, right? Like, whatever, right? You're in the town more than I am, right? When you go with your suit on and advocate for the things that the person that works at the needle exchange, you've got a different angle. You know, there is no solution other than systematic solution. Everything else is a Band-Aid. Period. End of discussion. You know, and not everybody has time to do both. But if you do, yeah.
I agree with you, and we're kind of coming to the end of this training, so I want to wrap up. But one of the things that I wanted to pose as well is, you know, kind of thinking about, people have said, like, we're addicted to the war on drugs in the sense that we keep doing the same thing despite negative consequences, and we just compulsively are doing it, and doubling down on these strategies. But maybe, and just maybe, one of the things that we could do is provide substitution to prosecutors who want to look decisive, who are elected, and they want to signal to their constituency. And that's why they do these ridiculous press conferences. They want to make it obvious that they're doing, making decisive, taking decisive action. And one of the things that it may be a reasonable thing to do is figure out what else they could be doing, who else they might be prosecuting to look decisive in addressing the crisis, but not essentially grinding people who are the lowest hanging fruit and putting them away at the taxpayer expense for decades. One of those groups that law enforcement is doing nothing about are really awful rogue treatment providers in many of your communities, right? People who pretend like they're running a drug treatment facility, and in fact, they're doing nothing of the kind, and they're basically just charlatans, and they're fleecing patients, and they're abusing patients, and this is where abuse is actually an appropriate term, and they're fleecing families, and people come out, and they overdose and die. Or they just, churn people over and over again. There's just one example of, hey, why don't you go after the real bad guys, of which, that's one example. Insurance companies are other examples. There are many people who are profiting on this tragedy who the prosecutors really should be going after. Mm-hmm. And they could, insurance companies arguably are also a really nice bad guy in the eyes of, sort of the public. So I think that, just expecting prosecutors to move away from the place where their incentives are, which is to get reelected, to get, to run for the AG, to run for governor, whatever it might be, they're building these careers on the necks of the most marginalized people. But there are other ways to build their careers, and I think maybe, not so much, on an individual level, but it may be useful to message to the media or in other kinds of narratives, like, why are they going after these individuals who really haven't played a role in driving overdose deaths, whereas these other actors, bad actors, are in fact doing that.
Many of them have been in treatment multiple times, have been expelled from treatment because the insurance ran out or the program ran out before the need ended.
Right.
And so
and there's tons of violations of insurance regulations.
There's absolutely a connection between
Right,
taking care of these people one person at a time, which is what defense lawyers do,
Right.
and the systematic problem.
Right.
These are not disconnected.
Right. I mean, we know, we had Liberation Way, which was a national scandal in our backyard. But also, we have to remember that most people that are going to treatment actually aren't getting treatment.
Right.
Right. They're not getting medication-assisted recovery. Most of your counties, SCAs,
This is a
don't even fund.
consumer protections disaster.
Right.
Why are we not doing consumer protections work? Right? And instead, because we have jammed the system with these ridiculous kinds of efforts and have actually crowded out appropriate law enforcement responses at the same time as clearance rates for murder, for rape, and other issues remain very low, right? So it's a semblance of action when in fact the action that's happening, there's some operational success because we're doing these press conferences, but at the same time, a lot of real violent crime is going unsolved. I don't know specifically, in Lancaster and Montgomery County, but nationally clearance rate for like homicide is incredibly low, for rape is incredibly low, and other violent crimes. So because law enforcement is, essentially churning people who really have no business being in that system in the first place.
This is a comment more than a question, and it might address the concern that some people had about what we can do as attorneys. The one thing that I have done and that I think we can do is that, if you write something to your local editorial board and you put it on your letterhead, they will publish it as an op-ed. If you are a local attorney, you will get published as an op-ed. And I can share from personal experience that I did this one time because I was pissed off in the wake of a jury acquittal. I got the client's permission and I told his story in an op-ed. And I can tell you with certainty that op-ed landed on the desks of people in the district attorney's office, that they talked about it, and that people approached me who worked there off the record and said, hey, we really appreciate your point, and it was discussed in our office. So our voices as attorneys can be heard,
Right.
and I think that we can selectively choose these situations where there is no longer any prejudice left to the client. Pick the client who got acquitted, get their permission, tell their story, and you can tell that you can use your voice as an attorney. So I just wanted to share that as an insight.
Mm-hmm. Or you could just write an op-ed about this training. Here's something that's happening in our community all the time. We're getting beat up over it. We're seeing 60, 70 cases over the last couple of years. This is what I learned, and I'm going to bring this community to protect people that are downtrodden by the system, the low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's like saying, you get cancer, and then District Attorney Steele comes and destroys your life. That's what it's like when you have a substance use disorder, right?
So I think that comment connects to what Devin was saying, which is that individually, a lot of the people in the defense bar are getting buried and snowed under by these cases. Mm-hmm. So I think it's hopefully this training can activate some of you to get involved on a sort of organizing level and think about working together to try to push back against this, whether it's in the infosphere, whether it's in the legislative sphere, whether it's working with with DAs to reorient them towards things that actually will make a difference in addressing this crisis. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you again all for being here.